If you haven't listened to episode 41, go back. I had to break this in half because it just got too big. There was too much stuff I could not leave out. Episode 42, The Labor Situation, 1660 to 1699. Hello, and welcome to the History of American Food. This week, I will be looking at how the labor market economics worked in colonial America and what happened after the Royal African Company started shipping West Africans into the Caribbean and then North America, how it changed the indentured servant scene, and the economics of labor in the New World. So pull up to your place at the table and let's dig in. The first thing you need to know is that as I dove into this deep pool of my unexamined assumptions, I realized I had never really thought about how the economics of all these things worked. How was money working in this whole indentured servant thing? And if we had this government-subsidized labor pool of 500,000 indentures being sent over to North America and the Caribbean from Great Britain for 150 years, why did we also need to purchase approximately 8 million African lives to fuel economic growth, agricultural and industrial, in North America and the Caribbean over a 200-year period? If these values seem small or short, I have specifically left South America out of the numbers. I realize this seems like it's off to the side of the food question, but as I said in the introduction to this series, American food has been tied to money-making plans from the very start. Whether through sugar, salt, tobacco, forest products, fish, beef, and all sorts of other things, the economics of the labor force to produce these products has always been an essential part of the equation of how American food happens, and is an important piece of what becomes American food and what does not. As a result, just how the labor market for different types of workers functioned turns out to play a pretty big part in how American food evolved. So to wrap up the 17th century, I have to look at the economics around the different designations of workers and how things changed with the rise of the Royal African Company in 1660. I'll explore how obligate labor was used to make the food scene of the British colonies go, and how it warped the economics of food production in Great Britain and set up America to start out with a whole pile of misconceptions when it came to just what it cost to make food. The seeds for that system that grew into America's modern, cheap, and plentiful food were planted all the way back at the beginning, and depended then, as now, on underpaying for farm and food preparation labor. Other than knowing that ship captains weren't operating charities, that buying up provisions for a voyage wasn't cheap, and that sailors were getting paid somehow, I had never really stopped to think about just how the money flow would work for someone who couldn't pay their way up front. There certainly was no credit card they could pay off. Because money-making, or at the very least paying off debts, was integral to the colonization story of America, the cost and the profitability of different foodstuffs has been integral to the American food story. The question of whether a food was economical to eat or feed people, whether they are family members, employees, servants, or slaves, is something that comes up almost constantly in the contemporary written accounts of food in America. From the very beginning, the cost of a food had a big hand in determining its goodness or fitness for different purposes. And that trend continues even to this day. And much of the cost of foods, beyond their rarity, often has to do with how much labor goes into their production. Barring a few hunters and trappers, most of the people who were transported across the Atlantic involuntarily and by choice during the 175 years before the United States was formed, regardless of their continent of origin, Africa or Europe, were involved in a giant terraforming project. The people who were making decisions about what the emerging America was to be, they looked upon the land and decided it needed work if it was to ever produce serious money. There were too many trees, there were no fences, there were no proper fields, and there were no houses worth the name. Other than some tasty fish and meat animals, there were no proper food crops, there were no pigs, and there was not a draft animal in sight. So those would have to be brought over as well. When one is clearing and planting fields, splitting rails and constructing dwellings with nothing more than some serious elbow grease, the wood chopping, the building buckets to carry water, and the axe sharpening requires thousands of human hours of work, as does capturing, processing, and cooking all that food to feed all that labor. The amount of work was immense, and the number of people to do it was tiny. So the couple of hundred Europeans that were trying to set up permanent homes were desperate for more people to take on or share the load, to the point where they were willing to pay the way of getting people there. The land was free, so it was possible to pay to get the labor over there. And up front, the indentured servants were also artificially cheap because the government was subsidizing their capture and organizing their transshipment. So ship captains found they could make money transporting these indentures. Colonists would pay the cost of the passage, and the captains would charge as much as the market would bear, but spend as little as possible on the passengers. Because the crown was nominally involved, the rate a passage could be sold for had something of a cap. There was only so much that could be charged, with the government occasionally looking on. The spirits, the agents, and the captains could not actually sell the workers. And this ultimately is what limited the profits to be made transporting workers. As a result of the initial injection of indentured servants in the 17th century, the plan of growing and harvesting bulk raw materials cheaply for export to earn cash to import the fine and fancy things of the old world began to work out just as the minds behind colonialism had hoped they would. So by the middle of the 17th century, labor was the most of movable wealth, just as old Mixon would conclude in the 18th century. The indentured servant system whet everyone's appetite for the greater riches just beyond the horizon. But a few issues had to be resolved in order to reach that river of gold. What to do about those limitations I mentioned in the last episode? What to do about that practically biblical requirement that labor contracts have an end? And what to do about the moral quandary of abusing fellow Christians? What if Great Britain could supply workers to their new Caribbean sugar islands that weren't Christians at all? If so, it would give their captains greater profit since they could sell people and not just passages. And any punishment or work regime would be allowed because remember Pope Nicholas V? He said as long as they weren't Christians, it was okay. Wait, weren't the British against the Catholic Church now? Well, sure, yes, but this was from the before times when the popes were good and, most importantly, were writing policy the British agreed with. Okay. Oh, and bonus. Since these would be chattel slaves, that is, permanently purchased into the servile state with no contractual end at all, every child with at least one servile parent, almost always the mother, were slaves as well, regardless of the state of the other parent. So by moving into purchasing people in Africa and turning them into slaves by contract and transportation, the Royal African Company offered a solution to the nearly permanent labor shortages in Barbados and then Jamaica, and then the other Caribbean islands the British would claim. They were about to offer the same solution to the labor problem, both indoors and out, to the mainland as well. But first they would create a market for beef and lower-grade saltfish that would build many a coastal fortune in Massachusetts, Rhode Island, Virginia, and the Carolinas. And this transformation was made possible by draining West Africa of a large chunk of its most vital people, and wasting all their dreams and potential by transporting them to do manual labor, far from home, for nothing more than meager food, basic shelter, and inadequate clothing. And in the case of most of them, especially in the Caribbean, a nameless grave in a land far from home. Not all enslaved West Africans went to work sugar, but the first of them in 1503 did, and in the 17th century, nearly all of them did. Over the 250-year span that the British were importing Africans into the Caribbean and North America, only about 388,000 were directly shipped to North America, and an estimated 75,000 were transported north from the Caribbean. So only about 450,000 Africans were ever brought to American shores. This means that the Caribbean was a fast grave for the approximately 8.2 million people who were purchased for their labor in the sugar fields. The lifespan of a sugarcane worker was estimated to be around 4 years. This was true of the indentured servants before 1660 and of the enslaved Africans after 1661. But the survivors of one group were allowed to blend in and leave that past behind and become citizens of the British Empire, and then their new countries. The other group would have to fight through their lifetime, and many, many more, to be recognized once again as free persons. And even then, the fight to be just people, real full citizens of the countries they inhabited, well, that was going to be a whole nother project. 1661 is the year England put its first laws into place on the island of Barbados to officially make it so all transported Africans were chattel slaves. This Barbados Slave Code officially, quote, an act for the better ordering and governing of Negroes, unquote, officially placed any person purchased in one of the slave markets in West Africa and landed on Barbados after this date legally outside the protection of English common law. That code was approximately 400 years old in 1661. So to get around this idea, all persons purchased in Africa were designated things instead of persons. The same language would then be adopted in similar codes in the colonies of Jamaica, South Carolina, Georgia, Virginia, and Maryland. Before then, there was a hodgepodge of policies that varied from town to town and colony to colony on indentures and limits on the years someone could serve as a slave. And there were arguments about the legal status of a child if its mother was enslaved. The slave codes worked to make things clear and make the rules similar as one traveled from place to place. Whenever an event that will have worldwide and historical implications occurs, I find it fascinating to look over the globe and see just what else was going on in the world. In this case, Galileo had recently died after his fight with the Vatican. Not yet a Sir, Isaac Newton had just gone up to Trinity College, Cambridge, and was 5 years from his discovery of the laws of gravitation. Louis XIV was really getting into big hair in France. The Mughals were in charge in India and had finished the Taj Mahal in 1631. They were also figuring out just how to unite the mind-boggling assortment of religions, languages, occupations, terrains, and traditions into a viable economic entity that was starting to attract the notice of England. The Blue Shah Mosque was completed in Isfahan in what is modern-day Iran. Dutch and English pirates were crashing ships on the Australian coast, but no one was making a big deal yet about discovering it. And the Ming dynasty had just collapsed and given way to the Manchu or Qing dynasty in China. And for the sake of sweetness and cash, the English had resurrected the idea of non-person humans and written it into their body of law. It was from this slave code that chattel slavery would return in formal written law to the English-speaking world. It will set up industrial food production systems that largely hadn't been seen by Europeans since the heyday of the slave plantations of Imperial Rome. And it will create divisions in the young America that will nearly rip the country in half. The ripples of this choice of creating a set of non-person humans based on religion and skin color still ripples about in our everyday lives, down to people being afraid to let their children learn about or discuss it. These were hard episodes to write, not wanting to leave anything important out, not wanting to get important things wrong. And unlike, say, butter, where everyone's comfortable with saying, "I didn't know that. Oh, that's interesting." Now I'm challenging some long-held beliefs or established ideas about how the world worked. So yes, the hardest episodes to write, but the ones I'm going to continue to make each season. Next week will be much more fun and hopeful. I have fun questions to answer and a quick preview of Season 2 to give, including the food and skills that also came west from Africa and permanently altered the American food scene. A warning about my upcoming research hibernation and the possibly foolhardy reveal of the vague long-term trajectory of this whole project. Thanks for joining me on these tough topics. Show notes for this episode will be at thehistoryofamericanfood.blogspot.com. Again, promise to finish that. Any email, questions, or quibbles will reach me at thehistoryofamericanfood@gmail.com. Along with the promised pictures and links, I'll also include any interesting media I consumed for the episode. This time it'll be pictures of all the contemporary historical people and places I mentioned. Music for this podcast is Fingerlympics by Dr. Turtle, and the link to the show notes is also on the show's Twitter bio @THOAFood and in the show description.